Fact of life. Not everywhere in the UK is equal in terms of revenue. You got your major industrial, cultural, or even socio-political centres like Manchester, Birmingham, or that London. Places where money happens, where a Granada or a Thames can thrive and become major players, even international ones. And behind them you've got the rural areas in the southwest and the east and the far north of England, where money is something that happens to other people, and someone like TSW almost has to concentrate on its region because it can't afford to think any bigger. But to the people who live in its catchment area, the TSWs and the Grampians of the world are just as important as any LWT or ITV you could name. More so, because it's theirs. Even so, the limited scope of these companies limits mine in turn. Sometimes there just isn't 30 minutes of material, or even 20, which is why this episode is a 2-in-1, paying tribute to those companies that, through no fault of their own, just didn't have the historical stamina for a whole half hour. The Frontier and the Islands.
Hello and welcome to 21 glorious years of border television. Where does the time go? It seems like only yesterday that I sat down in this very studio for border television's very first broadcast.
Here is the border news. A Langham farmer, as yet unnamed, was today involved in what an eyewitness described as an accident.
Border television came into being almost by accident. The existing transmitters for the north of England and the south of Scotland were positioned in a way that left a bit of a gap in between. People in Dumfries and what was then Cumberland could sometimes pick up the likes of Scottish and Granada, but not brilliantly. And it was always obvious they weren't their stations in the same way. Plus it was just messy to have a gap in the national coverage, so in 1960 the ITA commissioned 2 new transmitters, one in Carlisle, one in Selkirk. Naturally Granada and ABC were interested in the former, while Scottish figured they would naturally acquire the latter, but it was not to be. This was too much like expansionism for the ITA's taste, and they announced that control of the new transmitters would be going to a new company, to be determined, and also given fair warning from the ITA that this region wasn't exactly going to be a major national priority. That new company was to be Border Television, a consortium consisting of a roughly 50-50 split between local talent and a few genuine broadcasting heavyweights, most notably the chairman of Reuters. They got the job in the summer of 1960 and prepared themselves to serve from Peebles to Barrow-in-Furness from February 1961. Except the transmitters weren't ready. So instead, Border went live in September 1961, making them the third from last region in the British Isles to get ITV, after the Channel Islands and North Wales, unless you count the Isle of Man, which was added to Border's purview in 1965. Anyway, here's how it looked.
This is Border Television, broadcasting to Cumbria, South Scotland, the Isle of Man and North and West Northumberland, from the Colbeck, Selkirk and associated transmitters of the Independent Broadcasting Authority.
Border's logo was deliberately abstract. On one level it's fairly simple. As TV Cream once put it, it's obviously a B for border. Kind of. The semi-rounded parallelogram thing represents Border's catchment area, while the bifurcated line in the middle stands in for the border itself. The overall effect is of something that's reminiscent of a capital B, almost in spite of itself. Being non-representational and relatively easy to replicate, it was perfect for a minnow like Border, because devoid of any inherent pre-existing significance, it was free to take on the sigil-like status enjoyed by the HTV Ariel, or the Yorkshire Chevron, or the TSW whatever the hell that thing was. Put less pretentiously, because it's meaningless, it makes its own meaning, and that meaning is Border. Of course, Border were never the richest channel in the network, and by never the richest, I mean almost always the poorest. This static black and white caption lasted throughout the 60s until the arrival of colour in 1969, when it was replaced with this static colour caption. Although for all intents and purposes, for the vast majority of the region's viewers, it was still in black and white. The only reason they got any colour at all before the 60s ended was their geographical good fortune in being sandwiched between two major players in Scottish and Grenada. By contrast, the relatively isolated southwest had to wait until 1971. Serves us right for being a peninsula. On top of that, for the first few years, this ident was quite often the only colour broadcasting Border could afford to make at all. And an ident with sound and motion would have cost another $6,000. Fortunately, in-vision continuity was still a thing. In fact, Border never actually dropped the practice per se, it was just murdered by outside progress with the imposition of the Hearts idents and the closing down of Border's continuity studios and the eventual homogenisation of ITV as a whole. Border Television was still using human faces as late as mid-1999, which makes them the second from last ITV station to carry on with IVC, after Border's faces and voices were a varied bunch, including the breathy Leslie Kearney,
You only live twice,
the improbably named Leslie Crowther waxwork Pat Doody,
Help the Aged,
Susanna Boccaccio, whose bangs are mighty,
with Bramwell at 9 and the movie Frantic later on, but
and the ludicrously plum-voiced Clive Champney, who I'm pretty sure is some sort of laird.
Tomorrow evening, there are two new series beginning. There's Foxy Lady, starring Diane Keane, at 8 o'clock, and at 8:30 a new series of World in Action. At 9 o'clock there's Harry's Game, and of course tomorrow at 10:30 we continue the Gangster Chronicles. Those are some of the programmes. Alan Cartner will be your announcer.
And then there was international playboy Craig Austin, who I'm pretty sure was in Hue and Cry.
Coronation Street, You Bet, and Missing. Back to tonight though, and there's comedy.
More than just an announcer, Austin was responsible in the late 80s for giving Border a shot of adrenaline, decreasing the reliance on network trailers, increasing the amount of in-vision, and even introducing a computer-generated version of that still ident. They may have been tiny, they may even have been insignificant compared to someone like Thames, but there was no reason they couldn't stand out. No reason they had to be consumed by a gigantic, generic ITV... Oh, God damn it! Civic pride is all very well, but the boss is still the boss. When the 1989 generic look came along, Border weren't really in any great position to argue. If anything, they benefited from it, unlike just about everyone else, because for the first time their ident had animation and music. The triangle conceit even came close to working, or at least it didn't fail outright. And while the self-made presentation and in-vision continuity was scaled down a bit to make room for the new ITV logo, they weren't dropped altogether. Border's sense of self was compromised as little as possible. They were still representing for them gangsters all across the borders. And it wasn't as if they were unheard of on the national stage. They may not have had a lot of cash to spend, but game shows were almost insultingly cheap to make, and that was where Border found their niche. With the dawn of daytime TV in Channel 4 in the 80s, they had a couple of small but useful gold seams to mine that kept them from complete meltdown and kept their name and odd-looking logo in the national consciousness, filed somewhere around the back, next to the name of that guy who was in that thing. Ultimately, Border kept the generic ident for 4 years, longer than anyone save Grampian, who only dropped it at all because ITV changed their logo. But of course, that's another episode. In 1993, Border launched the first fully animated and scored ident that they'd actually made for themselves. Quite a pleasant ident as it goes. The animation is necessarily simplistic, but the backdrop is highly reminiscent, in a good way, of what you might see on a larger station's trailer for their spring season of programming. There's a freshness about it. A Glade plug-in sort of freshness, admittedly, but freshness all the same. You would of course have noticed that they managed to save a bit of scratch by simply reusing the David Dundas jingle, but then the Crankies and Wade the Lakes weren't exactly raking in the cash by now. And besides, this was the shark eat shark post-broadcasting act era of laissez-faire capitalism. For the smaller companies it was an exercise in raw survival, and one they all ended up losing. Somewhat ironically, it was the very insignificance of the region that enabled them to survive the blind auction in 1991, because no bugger even attempted to bid against them, allowing them to win by default on a bid of 52 grand a year. Having ensured their continued existence in this newly deregulated era, Border now had to survive it. And they chose to do so by playing the game, punching somewhat above their corporate weight with outside investments, specifically radio. In 1993 they were awarded the franchise for a new independent local radio station for the bottom half of Scotland, in a consortium with Grampian Television and with a Border non-executive director at the helm. Specifically the chart-busting pop idol Sir David Steele.
You can help me to change the face of British politics. Let's pull our country together.
And that's quite enough of that. This turned out to be Scot FM, and its first months on air were not entirely unlike those of TVAM and GMTV, up to and including a desperate relaunch that involved the entire on-air team being replaced. Border, for their part, lasted just 7 months before giving it up as a bad job and selling their half to Grampian. Meanwhile, on screen, Border had got wind of the mid-90s fashion for huge chunks of chromium on undulating blue backdrops. This technically would turn out to be the last Border ident, but it evolved over time. First, after a year or so, they finally managed to provide their own music for the first time, if not their own tune. Looking very relaxed, Adolf Hitler on vibes. After another couple of years, the backdrop was made more abstract and less wet. And for the one and only time in Border's history, their ident got a completely original jingle, albeit one that sounds a bit like a cross between both of David Dundas' generic ITV tunes. While this excitement was developing, Border had launched their second offensive on the radio front, with the far more successful Century Radio, based in the northeast and headed by two former continuity announcers. Unlike Scot FM, this one actually caught on, and after a while 2 more stations were established in Grenadaland and the Midlands. Eventually Border had to form a subsidiary holding company to keep track. Unfortunately, this would lead to the company's downfall, as other independent radio companies started to resent the presence of an upstart ITV franchisee on their turf. The nation's biggest independent radio company, Capital, started sniffing around, sneering that Border's mere existence didn't even make sense in an increasingly consolidated international broadcasting industry. As if things need to make sense to exist. Still, you can't argue with the invisible hand, because it's invisible, and by 2000, Capital had succeeded in buying out Border Television, and then immediately sold all the non-radio assets to Granada. Of course, by then, ITV's invasion of the Body Snatchers had landed, and Border came off particularly badly. They didn't even get to keep their symbol. Further humiliation was to come in 2009, when ITV's then chairman Michael Grade announced his plans to destroy the vestigial remains of regional ITV, singling out Border in particular for, echoing Capital 10 years earlier, not making sense. What remained of the station was shut down and sold off, and its operations merged with Tyne Tees to create a new region called ITV Sit Down and Shut Up. Except for the Isle of Man, which was shoehorned into the Grenada region because derpity-doo. The only consolation, and it really wasn't one, was that at this stage, with the entire network united against its will, it didn't really make very much difference, apart from losing look around. Fortunately, ITV did a mini U-turn in 2013 and brought back a much scaled down border service, but again it didn't actually make very much visible difference, except for getting look around back. It's still run from Gateshead in much the same way that my region, the South West, was merged with HTV West and is now run from Bristol. Well, Cornwall, Bristol, it's only 150 odd miles difference. The accents are almost the same, although they get less comprehensible the further west you go. But I don't make a show up no different on them barb ratings, do it? That's what's important, it's just interchangeable blobs of carbon else. Our next stop is actually a part of my region, at least by the BBC's reckoning, although they're not actually particularly close by, and in fact not even part of the UK at all, technically. Say hello to the Channel Islands. In purely practical terms, bringing ITV to the Channel Islands was easily the biggest pain in the arse of all. They're far closer to France than they are to Britain, and by that I mean literally off the coast of France and nowhere bloody near Britain, technically speaking. Essentially bilingual, trilingual if you count Charest and Guernesey, and as crown dependencies they're not even legally part of the same country. They have the Queen, but technically for their purposes she's actually the Duke. No, not the Duchess, the Duke. Oh, and they're not a single entity. And I don't just mean physically, they function as two separate jurisdictions. The bailiwick of Guernsey, which consists of Guernsey, Alderney, and all the little islets and skerries like Sark and Herm and so on, and the bailiwick of Jersey, which consists of Jersey. Because they're so bloody far away, the islands were the last territory in or of or related in some way to Britain to get ITV outside of North Wales. And inevitably it was a nightmare to set up. For a start, the 1954 Television Act, which had brought ITV into existence in the first place, had completely overlooked the islands, presumably because of that thing where they're not part of the UK. So right from the outset there was a whole other level of rigmarole for the ITA to go through, bothering the Privy Council and the bailiwicks before the concept could even be given the go-ahead. Once that hurdle was overcome, they were faced with the more practical problem of how to get the signal to the islands in the first place, given that there was no damn space on any of them to build a fully functional VHF transmitter station. Eventually they decided to build a relay on Alderney, the most northerly island, that would take a feed of the national network out from westwards transmitters in Devon and bounce it out to Jersey, where the station studios would be housed. It wasn't a perfect solution. For a start, it meant Alderney, reduced to the status of an extension cord, would have to go without for the then foreseeable future. But then for a while, it looked like that may not matter, because absolutely no one on the island seemed to be willing to lease them the land to build this bloody relay station on. After 2 years' worth of pulling teeth, it all finally came together in 1962, and the logically named Channel Television launched with this. The lower 5 hexagons represent the main Channel Islands: Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, despite the fact they couldn't get it yet, Sark, and Herm, permanent population 60, no cars or bicycles allowed. And of course a 6th hexagon displaying a cat's head, which represents the head of a cat. Not being from the islands, the significance, if any, of the feline imagery escapes me. The arrangement of the hexagons might be a part of it, forming as it does an extremely heavily stylized line passant, but like I said, I have no idea if that has any cultural significance, or if the designers just thought, lions are cool, let's have a lion, which, if true, is fair enough. This ident and logo lasted for well over a decade. Channel, after all, were even poorer than Border, never making any network programming at all, outside of the old anthology piece or contribution to the telethon. And this latter-day take on it's a knockout without the chortling rapist. But it doesn't really count because it was a co-production with Carlton, as if you needed to ask, and it was well after regional television had bit the dust anyway. Besides, colour didn't come to the islands until the mid-70s, along with UHF broadcasting, which finally allowed Alderney to be covered properly. Progress was slowed down still further by the 1968 technician strike, which you'll recall I mentioned in the Yorkshire episode. Assuming you've been paying attention, you'll remember that strike effectively killed off the ITV regions for a few weeks, replacing it with a ramshackle improvised national service. Except in the Channel Islands. Uniquely, among the entire network, Channel survived the strike untouched, because both the unions, the ITA and the other regions knew that even a fortnight off the air would kill the company altogether. When it happened again on an even larger scale in 1979, blacking out the entire network for 3 months, Channel alone somehow kept broadcasting, like a shark that knew it would die if it stopped swimming. For 3 months, while the proper UK were faced with the blue screen of death, Channel desperately hurled local programming, random films, and basically anything they could grab that would fill an amount of airspace, until finally collapsing, weeping with relief on the neck of the return network in October.
Welcome home to ITV. Welcome home, welcome home. Welcome home, welcome home.
By then, Channel had a new logo, and technically a new name. One that would hold them in good stead for another couple of decades, and one that looked eerily like that of an unfamiliar European cable network, of the sort you might accidentally stumble onto while listlessly going through the satellite channels at a relative's house. Initially it just sat there while a slightly haunting fanfare played, but later it was set in motion, which just enhanced the Euro-alien feel. Incidentally, the jingle is a bit of off-the-shelf library music, as you might expect, one of about 800 arrangements of the superstar fanfare motif by Keith Mansfield, the godfather of Vaporwave. A funny thing happened, however, when CGI arrived for the first time, with the special 25th anniversary ident. Somehow, it started to feel more American than European. With the rich colours and the heavy blurring caused by the moiré effect, it even feels vaguely like it was filmed in NTSC, even though it wasn't. And the synthesised music sounds tailor-made for a swishy, monolithic closing logo to go after some imported American chat show on BBC Two in the afternoon. This is an impression that CTV would do nothing to quench with further updates. First, however, the 1989 generic look has to have its look in. Here's how Channel's version looked. Is it even worth saying at this point that it's not a good fit? Channel were offered this thing, but having little enthusiasm for the mainland, joined TSW, Anglia and others in turning it down flat, sticking with their spinning and defiantly foreign-seeming stripy logo. They had envisioned continuity, of course, but it's hard to get hold of. Doesn't help that it's incredibly counterintuitive to search for Channel television. From what I can tell, it seemed to largely consist of friendly but worried looking people sitting in front of an unremarkable backdrop. So fairly standard. The most notable face of Channel actually belonged to Oscar Puffin, the island's equivalent of Gus Honeybun, with his regular and highly similar birthday card slot, Puffin's Place. Terrible title. But I dare say it seemed quite witty when the slot started, back in 1963, when Gus was still but a kitten hopping around Dartmoor. In later years, in fact, the Honey Bun would often cameo on his mentor's show, even after being forced into retirement by the end of TSW. Anyway, the spinning ident continued, uninterrupted by Imperial dogma, until 1992, when technology had both improved and become cheap enough to replace it with this discordant and faintly troubling upgrade. Viacom. Seriously, this wouldn't seem all that out of place at the end of a Channel 4 showing of Donahue or Ricky Lake or something, with the blue gradient background and giant chrome logo made of stripes, because stripes were very popular in American graphic design in the 80s. Even the music is vaguely reminiscent of Lauren Martella Pictures or Fremantle International's efforts, or it would have been if it had been in tune. The unpleasant music, in fact, was a real sticking point, and before long it and the animation were tidied up. See, that's much more pleasant, and strangely more French. I'm not sure why, it just is. It's almost as if everything I say is arbitrary, although it isn't. This lasted until 1998, when not only was the CTV logo dropped after almost a quarter of a century, but the whole notion of a logo was just hurled out of the window in favour of this explicitly ambient collection of word art, with no centre, just a collection of elements in motion interacting with each other. It might be the only ident in British history to have been designed under the same principles as Brian Eno's initial ambient compositions. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I leave for you to decide. Either way, it didn't last long, because by the end of 1999, the second generic look was upon us. And having learned from the first one, this time no one had the power to turn it down. But Channel turned it to their advantage, using it as a platform for their own new logo, a genuinely lovely piece of design featuring a globe on which everyone in the world has been crudely shoved into their own hemisphere at the back, leaving the Channel Islands to take pride of place in the centre. Exactly how much of a coincidence the heart motif was, I can't say, but it certainly helped the logo fit better atop the generic ident's backdrop. It was this that they adapted in 2002 for their 40th birthday. They continued to resist ITV's homogenisation as long as they possibly could. When ITV brought in their crap celebrity-filled idents to symbolise the crushing once and for all of regional television, Channel simply glued their logo on top of ITV's, and even then tended to lean towards the ones showing their own faces. But this isn't the Mighty Ducks, and the Channel Islands aren't Scotland, or even Ulster. They couldn't hold out forever. By 2006, while the island views remained, the Channel logo was replaced with the new one for ITV1, albeit with Channel Television begrudgingly listed underneath. They lasted another 5 years as an independent company, before finally running out of time in November 2011 and setting up to ITV plc. And once ITV brought in that terrible new logo, all remaining traces of Channel Television were wiped from the screen for good. Border and Channel. They may not have been big hitters, they may not even have had enough history of their own for a single episode each, but they mattered exactly as much as Thames or Granada, because to the people they served in Northumbria, Dumfries, St Helier and Castell, to those people they mattered the most of all of them, because they were theirs.
are the little folk too little to love or to hate. Leave us alone and you'll see how we can drag down the state. We are the worm in the wood. We are the rot at the root. We are the taint in the blood. We are the thorn in the foot.
I hope we'll still be here in another 21 years' time. I know I will be, because I live here. It's the only place I'll ever get a job. Good night.